How did the son of Italian immigrants build the largest bank in America? In 1906, an earthquake reduced San Francisco to rubble. The city's banks sealed their vaults, leaving families with nothing. Amadeo Giannini did the opposite. He hid cash under crates of fruit and set up a wooden plank on the street, lending to families desperate to rebuild their lives. That wagon of cash was the start of an empire, one that would go on to finance the Golden Gate Bridge, save Hollywood from collapse, and reshape American banking. But before any of that, Giannini would face his fiercest enemies yet, the bankers of Wall Street. Today's story is an irony of America itself. In a country that tried to shut immigrants out, it was the child of immigrants who built the largest bank in history. Amadeo Giannini grew up in California at the turn of the century, the son of Italians who had crossed an ocean chasing opportunity. When his father died young, Amadeo learned how to survive without wealth or connections. He worked the produce markets, side by side with farmers and laborers who spoke broken English and lived on the edge of poverty. In the eyes of the city's bankers, these people barely counted. Credit was reserved for merchants, landowners, men of influence. Giannini saw something else. To him, they weren't outsiders. They were the backbone of the city, and all they lacked was someone willing to believe in them. That stance made him a target. Bankers called him reckless, newspapers branded him a gambler, even friends warned he was chasing failure. Still, Giannini pressed forward. For him, the real currency was trust, and he was willing to stake everything on it. In 1906, he opened the Bank of Italy, a name that reflected his roots. After making his first fortune in produce, he sold his stake to launch a bank with one vision: to serve the working families who had been ignored by traditional banks. Then came the earthquake. At 5:12 a.m. on April 18th, the city shook apart. Gas lines burst, fires spread block to block, and by the time it ended, San Francisco was in ruins. Most bankers locked their vaults, thinking their money would survive sealed in steel. But the fires burned too hot, the metal bent, paper turned to ash, and entire fortunes disappeared behind doors that no one could open in time. Giannini refused to risk it. He gathered every dollar his bank had, stacked it into a wagon, and hid it under crates of fruit so no thief would notice. Through smoke and rubble, he rolled it out of the city. That saved his bank, but his next move is what set him apart. As the fires smoldered, thousands of families and shopkeepers stood among the ashes with nothing left to rebuild. Without money moving, the city had no chance to rise again. So he acted. On a street corner, he placed a wooden plank across two barrels and called it his bank. Crowds lined up, families with nothing left, workers with no paper to prove they could pay, all of them desperate for a chance. Giannini lent on trust, small loans for lumber, a few dollars to restart a shop, promises sealed with a handshake. He knew exactly what he was doing. If he backed the people when they had nothing, they'd never forget who stood by them. From a plank and a wagon, Giannini had planted the seed of something far bigger than a neighborhood bank. The Bank of Italy had survived the flames, and now it was ready to rise with the city itself. How could Giannini hand out money in the middle of chaos, with no contracts, no ledgers, no guarantees? For him, the answer was simple. He had lived their world, bargaining with farmers at dawn, watching dock workers haul cargo until their hands bled, seeing shop workers fight to keep shelves full in a language they barely spoke. These were not gamblers looking for a handout. They were Italians, Irish, Chinese, Portuguese, families who survived on reputation. If they promised to repay, they would. That trust became the foundation of his bank. Word spread through the neighborhoods. There was a banker who didn't ask for pedigree, only honesty. Giannini's way of banking was mocked by the city's elite. To them, the Bank of Italy was a backstreet outfit, an immigrant bank with no place among the grand banks downtown. Yet, the more they mocked, the more deposits poured in. Workers trusted him because he spoke their language, not Italian or Spanish, but the language of risk and reward they lived every day. And for every customer he gained, he made another enemy. By the end of the decade, the Bank of Italy was no longer a curiosity, it was a rival. its growth threatened the very bankers who had once laughed it off. And they weren't laughing anymore. Branch by branch, Giannini spread across California, Oakland, San Jose, Stockton, Fresno, Bakersfield. Wherever workers needed credit, he planted a bank. It worked. Farmers dug canals, vineyards expanded, shops restocked and reopened. Money flowed where it never had before, and it all tied back to the Bank of Italy. By the 1920s, Giannini controlled more deposits than anyone in California. The son of immigrants was now one of the most powerful bankers in America. The Crocker family did not like that. They were San Francisco royalty, used to banking as a private club. To them, Giannini was an outsider with dirty hands, barging into a business reserved for their kind. They were not alone. The old guard lined up against him. Wells Fargo loyalists dismissed his chain of branches as reckless. Newspaper columns mocked his immigrant bank. Competitors were positive that if one branch failed, the whole system would come crashing down. And it didn't stop with talk. Rivals pushed lawmakers in Sacramento to ban branch banking entirely. City officials tried to block his permits. Regulators were pressured to stop him before his influence grew. Giannini fought back the only way he knew, by opening more branches. He argued in public hearings, he wrote letters to the press, and when the laws were drafted to shut him down, he organized customers to testify on his behalf. For every door they tried to close, he forced another open. By 1927, the Bank of Italy had more than 400 branches, the largest network in the nation, bigger than anything his rivals had ever imagined. But Giannini wanted more. In 1928, he merged the Bank of Italy with a smaller Los Angeles outfit called Bank of America and kept the name. To him, this was a statement, not a bank for one city, but for an entire nation. The timing could not have been better. The 1920s were in full swing. Stock prices climbed to record heights. Banks fueled a frenzy of speculation, certain the boom would never end. Ordinary Americans joined in, pouring their savings into a bubble built on paper wealth. But Giannini wanted no part of it. While Wall Street gambled on numbers, he put money behind things that could last. Farms, homes, small businesses, work that wouldn't vanish in a single night. Then came October 1929. The crash hit like a hammer. In days, stock markets collapsed. Banks went dark, millionaires were ruined. The titans of New York, who had once mocked his immigrant bank, were suddenly begging for air. But Giannini's Bank of America held firm. His customers still had orchards to harvest, houses to finish, shops to reopen. Real work, not paper bets. And his web of branches kept money moving when Wall Street froze. The same model rivals once called reckless had become the only one that worked. Due to the crash, he had to prepare for more than a downturn. What followed was one of the darkest periods in America's history, the Great Depression. Banks faced runs they could not survive. Farms collapsed as prices sank to the floor. Factories shut their doors. Bread lines stretched across city blocks. And millions were left jobless. Most bankers pulled back, hoarding cash and refusing to lend. Giannini moved the other way. He believed credit wasn't the danger, it was the lifeline. Families needed it to rebuild. Without it, recovery was impossible. While America was fighting to survive, Giannini had become the banker every financier quietly admired. This is where the story turns dangerous. The men he trusted most, the very partners inside his own boardrooms, were beginning to see him not as a visionary, but as a problem. Giannini was in his 60s, worn down from decades of battles. Younger men circled, led by Ora Monet, the Los Angeles banker whose smaller Bank of America Giannini had absorbed years earlier. To Monet and his allies, Giannini was a relic. Too reckless, too loyal to small borrowers when the future, in their eyes, belonged to big corporations and East Coast approval. They forced him out. In 1931, the founder was stripped of control in the very bank he'd built from a plank on a street corner. For a moment, it looked like his story was ending, but Giannini couldn't stay away. He hadn't built the bank just to see it turned into another fortress for the wealthy. If his name was going to mean anything, he had to leave a mark no one could erase. That chance came with a dream as bold as he was. a bridge across the Golden Gate, longer than anything the world had seen. Wall Street dismissed it as madness, too costly, too risky, impossible, in a decade when even strong banks were crumbling. Giannini saw something else. The bridge meant jobs, pride, a future. From retirement, he stormed back into the boardroom and demanded Bank of America finance it. Against all advice, he forced through $35 million. Construction began. Thousands of men found steady work when soup kitchens were still full. And when the bridge opened in 1937, glowing orange across the bay, it stood as proof that the gamble had paid off. And it wasn't his only gamble. In Hollywood, Warner Brothers was drowning. Walt Disney begged for credit to finish Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Wall Street bankers laughed him out of the room. Giannini backed him. The film became the first full-length animated feature in history, and a sensation. By the end of the 1930s, his bank was the largest in the nation. He had defeated rivals, silenced doubters, and proved them all wrong. Despite his success, partners still pushed back. To them, lending to farmers and shopkeepers was backward, even dangerous. They wanted a Wall Street bank for corporations, not an immigrant's dream. He wouldn't bend. Even in old age, he kept expanding across California, then across the nation. He planted branches in New York, daring to stand on Wall Street's doorstep. After the war, he reached overseas, financing the rebuilding of Europe and Asia, linking his bank to the future of entire continents. By then, the scale was incredible. Bank of America controlled more than $6 billion in assets, the equivalent of over $80 billion today. The largest private bank in the world. Giannini could have lived like a tycoon, surrounded by yachts, estates, and wealth. Instead, he kept his home modest and poured everything back into the bank, determined it to serve people, not him. However, he carried a fear. He had seen what bankers became, cautious, detached from the very people who needed them most. He worried that once he was gone, Bank of America would harden into the kind of fortress he had once fought to break. That's why he refused to fully retire. Even in his late 70s, Giannini came into the office, hovering over the men who thought they were his successors. He knew that if he stepped away, the empire he built could turn into something he dreaded. Amadeo Giannini died in 1949 at the age of 79. Crowds filled the streets for his funeral, not the bankers of Wall Street, but the workers, immigrants, and families who had once borrowed from him on nothing more than a handshake. Giannini started with a plank and a promise. He built the largest bank in America by backing the people others ignored. A city rebuilt, a bridge crossed the bay, Hollywood kept its lights on. However, size changes things. Banks drift, street corners fade. The nation still argues over immigrants, yet the economy still runs on their work. The bank remains. The handshake is rare. He showed what finance can be when it serves people first. The question is whether we still believe that.